So a hearty welcome on a beautiful day. It is great to see such a good crowd. I'm Mark Hennessy, Executive Director of the Gunflint Trail Historical Society. And these presentations are sponsored by Visit Cook County, so you can thank them, and by our gracious members who give donations and support Chik-Wauk Museum. So if you haven't been down to the museum yet this summer, I heartily invite you. We've got a lot of things going. Our Voyager selfie station has been a huge hit. People have loved seeing this new Trapper's Cabin exhibit, and we've got a wonderful staff too that can answer virtually any question that you may have. So please come early, come often. And programs, we've got a whole lineup of programs. I'm just going to go over the next few here for you. We have next Saturday, so note Saturday, we have Billy Blackwell doing a storytelling from a Anishinaabe perspective. That will be here. And then Sunday, we'll be back in our normal spot, which is at Chik-Wauk, the Nature Center, with Mark Zimmer, the barefoot paddler who barefooted every single portage in the Boundary Waters canoe area. So I'm excited to see that one. I know. August 9th is a Friday, is our Dark Sky Caravan Festival at Chik-Wauk. So make sure you come to that. It's that one starts at 5:30 at Chik-Wauk. And then Sunday, August 11th, this is not on our schedule, but my daughter, Anna Hennessy, who finished the Iditarod, is got a great presentation. She did it earlier at the North House Folk School. She's going to do a different presentation at Chik-Wauk on Sunday, August 11th. I'm going to stop there, but all of these are on our website, so make sure to check up on that frequently. I get the honor of introducing Cary Griffith, who I think I've read virtually every single one of his books. Fell in love with his writing, with Lost in the Wild, a really intriguing story about two gentlemen that got lost in the wild. So he's meticulous on research, interviewing people, does a fantastic job, and on top of that he also writes mysteries, and we have some of those. We had a big sale already on books. We'll be getting more of everything at the museum for sure, so make sure if you missed out on the rush and would like to get a copy of anything, we'll have all of his books at the museum. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Cary to talk about kind of his latest nonfiction work, mostly today. So thank you. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming out. This is an honor and a privilege. You know, I've written about this place. I was telling some people here, I've written about this place in Gunflint burning and driven by it several times, but I've never actually been in the place, so it's really nice. You know, and my wife said, you know, I don't know if you know this, but I dedicated this book, my latest nonfiction book, Gunflint, Falling Blowdown in the Boundary Waters, to Chik-Wauk and the Gunflint Trail Historical Society and all of you people. And my wife said, you know, Cary, it's an unwritten rule. If you dedicate the book to them, they have to invite you to speak.
And you have to give free books to everyone.
No, she didn't say that. No, but thank you very much for coming out today. It really is an honor and privilege. And many of you are people who were in the book, who I interviewed for the book. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. But I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief, probably 20, 25 minutes, because Then we'll have Q&A, any questions you have. But if people also, you guys are in a part of the world that was significantly impacted by both the Ham Lake fire of 2007 that I write about, and in this book, that even though it was published after Gunflint burning, I kind of feel is the prequel to that book, because this is about the blowdown of July 4th, 1999. And this is a silly question, I always ask it though, how many people here remember the blowdown from July 4th, 99? Yeah, most people. And probably some, was anybody in the woods during that time? Okay, so feel free during Q&A if you want to share any of your stories with us. I'd love to hear them. Obviously, I've talked to a lot of people, and I love to hear those stories. I write books, nonfiction and fiction. Today, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Gunflint falling. But this is another thing that I typically do in presentations like this. As a more tangible way of showing thanks, I'm going to give away a free copy of my latest novel, Dead Catch, which features walleye poachers and murderers on Lake Oh, you know, if somebody poaches walleye, they've got to be bad. On Lake Vermilion, not too far from here. But I don't give it away to just anybody. Here's how it works. During my presentation, I'm going to give you the answer to 3 yes, no, true, false questions. Now, the questions are going to be pretty easy, so I suspect most of you, or all of you, will get the answer correct. I can't, you know, to Dave's comment, I can't give a book to everyone, so I have a way of determining who wins the tie, but you've got to pay attention. Okay, one of the things about this book, I think about this book in a variety of ways, but first and foremost, this was a real village project. As I mentioned earlier, I have probably interviewed more than 100 people. I call out more than 60 in the acknowledgments. Without their help and support and stories, especially stories and willingness to come forward, and by the way, I'd say 97, 98% of the people I talked to were really forthcoming and willing to come forward and tell me their story. But not everyone. You know, this was a very traumatic event for a lot of people. So there were a handful of people that didn't want to come forward, which I totally respect. But it just tells me how good it was that many of you and many other people were willing to come forward and tell their story. Very important for a book like this. Without their help and support, this wouldn't have been written. I like to also think about this book as a chronicle of one of the first salvos fired in climate change, right? So even back in 1988, this director of NASA's Institute of Space Studies was talking about climate change and the greenhouse effect. And then, lo and behold, 11 years later, in '99, we had the blowdown. The blowdown was a huge event in the Boundary Waters. Not only the Boundary Waters, but in the Boundary Waters, very unusual for a climatological event of that extremity happening that far north. And so it's just sort of a chronicle event. A lot of people don't know this about the storm, but it was really a 6,000-mile storm. You guys probably know about it because it actually started just west of Fargo, crossed over into northwest Minnesota. Most of the damage, these black crosses, happened right in the Boundary Waters, but it kept heading east. This map actually shows only about 1,000 miles. Amazingly, even though it felled 48 million trees in the Boundary Waters, and on that 4th of July holiday, the 4th of July in 1999 was on a Sunday, so it was a great 3-day weekend. There were between 4,000 and 10,000 people in the Boundary Waters. Even though there were that many people in the Boundary Waters, no one died. Really amazing, really surprising. That said, as the storm kept going east, northeast through the rest of the day and into the 5th, people did die. That's how significant the storm was. As I mentioned, this is the first 1,000 miles. It went out into the eastern seaboard and went due south. It blew in at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It blew through the Mississippi Delta. It took 2 to 3 days to do this, and finally it burned itself out in the Gulf of Mexico. But it just gives you an idea of the intensity of this storm and the damage that it wreaked. As I mentioned before, most of the damage, this is a Forest Service map, most of the damage was done right in here, right where we are, right now, and throughout this long swath, deep swath. Almost 100% of the trees fell. As I mentioned before, 48 million trees fell in that area. And what I've tried to do in this book is sort of tell the story through human eyes. And I do that through a couple of rangers, Ranger Nicole Selmer. I interviewed Ranger John Pierce, but I had to cut the book a little short, and so his story, which was really compelling, did not get in there. But if you read Minnesota Conservation Volunteer in last month's issue, his story is in there, and he has a real great idea for what to do in the wilderness in summer if you want to avoid significant windfall damage or getting killed by a fallen tree. I also tell the story of Ranger Pete Weckman and camper Vicki Brockman, who was in Alpine Lake, very close, right next door to Seagull Lake here, and camper Lisa Nass. I'm just going to mention the thumbnail of those people today. I'll just mention briefly what happened to them. But significantly, this was a weather event. Now, all those people that I just mentioned were already in the boundary waters on July 4th. If they had paid attention to forecasts ahead of that time, even as late as 7:05 on July 4th, one of the things I learned is that the headquarters of the National Weather Service is in Norman, Oklahoma. On July 1st or 2nd, Norman, Oklahoma was keeping its eye on some storms that were happening in Montana and western South Dakota. At this time of year, storms come in from the west, and sure enough, these storms were starting to build in that area, and they were starting to head towards North Dakota and northern Minnesota. Now, they didn't think of telling their regional offices in Duluth and Grand Forks about those events, because they were almost positive that those storms that were building would dissipate as soon as they hit North Dakota. So you can see the July 4th, 7:05 in the morning, the forecast was for 4th of July, high in the middle 80s. You know, winds might be a little gusty, but nothing too untoward. 45 minutes later, those storms that Norman, Oklahoma had been watching 2 to 3 days earlier, their character abruptly changed, and they blew through Fargo and did significant damage, and they were bearing down on Bemidji. Now, the Grand Forks station has responsibility for northwestern Minnesota, forecasting the weather there. The Duluth station has responsibility for forecasting the weather here in northeastern Minnesota and the boundary waters. Well, sure enough, they issued a revised forecast at 10:55 July 4th, right before it hit Ely, that, you know, storms could produce hail and damaging winds. They sure did in Ely, but they didn't really begin getting intense and turn into a derecho. A derecho is defined as straight line winds of 80 miles per hour or higher that travels for at least 250 miles. That's where they started, just around Ely that morning, but they hit in Bemidji and elsewhere out west. But if you happen to be Lisa Nass, the camper I talked about earlier, or if you happen to be Vicki Brockman with her friends, you had no idea these storms were coming. You were in the boundary waters, you don't have access to cell phones. Remember, this is 1999, so there weren't a lot of cell phones, and the coverage was terrible. So they didn't have any idea any of this was coming, except for what they could see coming at them. Now, one of the stories I tell are these 3 women. Now, on July 1st, 55-year-old Sue Ann Martinson, Sue Ann is actually taking this picture. 55-year-old Sue Ann Martinson is making her maiden voyage into the boundary waters. Yeah. And she's met Jan Fiola and Vicki Brockman at a party recently. They're a little bit younger, 35, 40. And they tell her about this trip they're going to go. It's a circular trip. Some of you may have done this. You start right around here. You go up in the Sag. You go through Red Rock into Alpine and out Seagull. They've done this before. They're familiar with it. Moreover, Jan is a wilderness chef. She knows how to cook a good meal. And Vicki has brought in plenty of boxed wine, so they can, leave no trace. She's brought in plenty of boxed wine, and they say, Sue-Ann, you've never been in the Boundaries? You should come with us. What can go wrong? So sure enough, Sue-Ann rides along. She sits in the middle of the canoe, and it's great. The first day, on July 1st, they go to End of the Trail Campground. They stay there. The next day, they go to a local outfitter. They get outfitted. They head into Saginaw. The first night, they camp down in here on an island. They're all voracious readers. They have hammocks. They string them up. They read. And sure enough, Jan fixes a fabulous meal, and Vicki breaks out the wine, and Sue-Ann can't believe it. Now they're in one tent, right? And they work out this deal for how one of them lays one way, somebody in the middle lays the opposite way, and the other person lays in the opposite way. But that night, Sue-Ann hears the first loons she's ever heard, and she's just transported and thinks, wow, this has been such a beautiful day. I love this. So then, on July 3rd, they wake up, and the plan is they're going to portage, and they portage into Red Rock Lake. They portage through Red Rock Lake into Alpine Lake. And what they want to do is they have been, all these dots are campsites, they have been on this campsite before, which is across 50 to 100 yards across from the main portage from Alpine into Seagull Lake. And the plan is they're going to be there Saturday afternoon on the 3rd, and on the 4th they're going to spend the whole day the 4th there, and then the next day they're going to paddle out into Seagull on Monday the 5th, retrieve Vicki's car, and drive home. And sure enough, they get lucky. Alpine is close to the Boundary Waters edge, the border, so it's a popular lake. There's lots of campsites, but they do score the one campsite they wanted, and they get on it. Now, much further, this is just an example to show you the breadth and depth and length of this storm. Lake Polly, which is several miles west of where our west, sort of northwest of where our friends are on Alpine Lake, 5 friends get together and go up there. Now first, Ray and Michelle Oreo go in to score the Lake Polly site because they've examined it before. They know they want to, it's a real nice site. It faces west. Sure enough, they get it, and on July 3rd, Christina and Mark Schwendiger come in with Lisa Nass, and they follow the portage trail from, I kind of call this south central Boundary Waters, but they enter here and they go through these several portages, and they get up to Lake Polly in the afternoon, and it's very nice. It's a beautiful, and because they're so close, the Schwendigers have brought in some spaghetti or things that, not freeze-dried, some good food. Like our friends in Alpine Lake, I think Lisa Nass actually has brought in a pint of vodka with that, she told me this, with that powdered lemonade. But they also brought in Merlot, boxed wine. So they had a beautiful evening. Okay, so on the next day, our friends over in Alpine Lake wake up, and by all accounts on this day, you people that were there probably remember this, it was hot, and it was still, and the lake was like polished steel, Alpine and Polly Lake both, even though they were far apart. That's the way it was that day. And both parties, both groups refreshed themselves that morning by getting into the lake, and 2 or 3 times they'd get in to cool themselves off, come out. It was so hot, they'd get back into the lake. And sure enough, by about 11 o'clock, they noticed the skies to the west start, clouds begin building, and they really start getting ugly. I mean, ugly colors, purple, green, yellow, like the color of a bruise. They really change. In fact, one person, Jen Nagel, who was at the Wilderness Canoe Base near here, said, I looked at those clouds and I thought for sure we were going to have a tornado, because she's from southeastern Minnesota and that was the tornado weather at the time. By about 11:30, the winds pick up. They're actually thankful that the winds have picked up because it's so hot. But then the winds don't abate, they begin to intensify. And pretty soon, big raindrops fall, and pretty soon a curtain of water is falling from the sky. And they do what we would all do in an instance like that. They sought refuge in their nylon tent. Probably not the best idea, but what are you going to do? So they go into the nylon tent, and about 11:55, I'm certain about the time because I'll just go ahead and tell you that when this tree, this jack pine, falls on the tent, it hits Sue Ann Martinson's wristwatch and it stops exactly at 12 o'clock. So probably about 11:45, 11:50, Vicki looks up through that little peak in the top of their tent and sees the wind increase so much that the treetops are flying off the tops of the trees, and she tells her companions, get down, lay down, the trees are starting to fall around here. And sure enough, they lay down, and remember I told you, Vicki is on one side, on the outside of the tent, Sue Ann is in the middle facing in the other direction, and Jan Fiola is on the outside facing the opposite direction. And Vicki she's seen this and is really scared. She gets on her side, she bends down like this, and she covers her head with her arms like that, and then they hear this tree fall, and it falls right on Vicki's hip. Now Sue Ann claims that even in the maelstrom that's blowing around them, she can hear bones crack. And sure enough, when they finally get Vicki out to safety, her pelvis has been cracked in 13 places. So you can imagine Vicki is not going anywhere. There's no way to portage somebody out in a canoe when you've got that. So, you know, if you're looking for heroism from people, ordinary, everyday people, you will find it from these people. I was struck time and again by how amazing these people were. And Jan and Sue Ann Martinson were great. They helped her to safety. They told, you can imagine on Alpine Lake there was a mass exodus after the storm blew over because of their location where they were right across from the portage. The portage became impassable, but people didn't know that until they got there. When they got there, Sue Ann and Jan would tell people, you can't go, you got to go through this other portage, Alpine River, which is not used very often, but there was so much rain because it's kind of swampy. But there was so much rain that day that it became more of a juggernaut. It became the way to get out of Alpine Lake into Seagull. And so everybody that went by, they said, we have an injured friend, please send help. Similarly, in Pauley Lake, what happened with Lisa Noss is that Lisa had rented a small canoe from Sawbill Outfitters down on Highway 61. And in the height of the storm, she looked down and she saw the wind was so extreme, it was picking up her canoe and it was going to blow it into the woods. And she was really worried about it, so she ran down and tried to secure her canoe. And as soon as she did, this branch here broke off a treetop and struck her right in the head. It actually hit the side of her head. If it would have hit the back of her head, she probably would have died. But as it was, she was unconscious. A very similar situation. There was no way they were going to portage her out. So the Schwendniggers did the only thing they could at that time. Two people stayed with Lisa to make sure she was okay, and the other two raced as fast as they could out those portages, and amazingly, now remember this is 1999 and they have those flip phones, they managed to get out to the campground and get a signal and radio to the law enforcement folks that they had somebody down on Pauley Lake and they needed to be medevaced out. And sure enough, that's what they had. That's what happened to both of them. The last flight of the day, Lisa Noss was a little more fortunate. They got to her by late afternoon. That's the plane leaving Pauley Lake. This is Vicki Brockman on a gurney. They got help from the nearby folks at Wilderness Canoe Base. Jim, you probably know some of those people. Anyway, they got help from those people, and they managed, it was the last flight of the day by Pat Lowe, one of the U.S. Forest Service beaver plane outfitters. You can imagine that on this day, I think they flew, not on this day, but on the 24 to 48 hours after this event, they flew, I think they medevaced out 60 people from the Boundary Waters, but these people made it out this first day. And it was a good thing because, but when they took them into Ely, the medics said, there's nothing we can really do for you here. We've got to get you to a Trauma 1 center down in Duluth, and indeed, that's what they did. Now, when they got down to Duluth, mind you, this is probably 1 o'clock in the morning by the time they get down there. They examine Vicki Brockman, they do an x-ray, they see that her pelvis is fractured in 13 places, and there really isn't anything you can do. You can't put a cast on her. They just have to keep her quiet, and sure enough, after 2 or 3 weeks, she makes a full recovery. Her body just sort of healed itself. Lisa Noss was a little bit different. She made it just in time down there because she was starting to go comatose because there was so much pressure on her brain, and they actually operated immediately and relieved pressure on her brain, and she too made a full recovery. She did joke to me and say, I said, well, are there any lasting effects of that? And she said, no, she's an accountant, and I think by all accounts she's a really good accountant for Cargill. She said, no, you know, before people thought I was smart, but not so much now. Okay, by the numbers. It happened on July 4th, 99, approximately noon to 2 p.m. it did that. It flattened a swath of trees 40 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide, some of which was right here. It felled 48 million trees, damaged approximately 500,000 acres. In the first 2 weeks, there were 310 personnel working on it. I know many people here probably remember that time and can share some stories with us. It did almost $1 million of damage in that first 2 weeks. And one person said, Pete Weckman said to me, you know, we didn't realize that day, I heard lots of interesting stories, we didn't realize that day that we began working. He went out right after the storm and began helping people, doing search and rescue. And then we didn't realize what we were looking at a damaged forest that would occupy us professionally for the next 2 decades. And in fact, that is what happened. There's still blowdown in the Boundary Waters. That's just about it done, except we've got a sudden death contest to determine who wins dead catch. Okay, and I mentioned before, the questions are not too hard, but it's going to be a show of hands. First question, one of the injured people chronicled in Gunflint Falling is referred to as Jane Doe. True? False? Show of hands. You got, if you want to, you got to.
False.
False. I'm going to let you all in, but you got to show your hand. The July 4th, 99 BWCA blowdown felled 48 million trees. True?
True.
True. Yes. You were listening. Derechos, straight line winds that travel more than 250 miles, are common in the boundary lines. Oh, no. False. You're all in the running. So, who wins? The person sitting closest to me. All right, any questions or any comments or anything you guys want to, anybody that you want to share? Yeah. Mark.
What would be your humble advice about camping current time with more and more of these storms? What would you think about? What would you do?
Yeah, this time of year, you know, the ranger John Pierce that I told you about, if you read Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, his advice is that on the day, probably 3 or 4 years prior to the blowdown that happened on July 4th, 99, he actually was working for a YMCA camp, I think, as a counselor, and he helped rescue a couple of campers on I forget the name of the lake, but anyway, it was in the Boundary Waters, and a tree had fallen on one of them. And he realized that what they had done is they had picked a campsite that actually faced east. So they wanted to see the sunrise come up in the morning, and they thought it was it was a beautiful campsite with really big trees. And he realized, wow, if you want to avoid windstorms, which this time of year come out of the west, what you really want to do is camp on an eastern shore that faces west. And counterintuitively, if a windstorm like the July 4th blowdown happens, which he was right in the middle of, turns out, you don't run away from the wind, you run straight down to the shoreline, right into the wind, where you will avoid any fallen trees behind you. And that's what he did on July 4th, 99. He was in fishing with a couple of buddies. His buddies did just the opposite. They ran away into the woods, and he was with his dog. And he and his dog struggled through the rain down to the shoreline, and that was how he avoided getting caught. His buddies, it turned out, the trees fell all around them like pixie sticks, so they were able to get under some really big trees, and they survived as well. But that's his recommendation. Find that kind of campsite if you're going in. Yes?
Did they determine, or maybe it's not too much for this book, why it built so much, the storm built so much from that change? You said it changed abruptly. Is there any reason?
There is in the book. I kind of get into the meteorology a little bit, but I'm not a meteorologist. I've read several scientific reports about it, and it is complicated what happened. I mean, there was a low pressure system, met a high pressure system. I describe it in the book. Actually, Peter Leshak, I don't know if any of you know him, he's a firefighter and he's a writer, writes a lot for the Star Tribune, has written several books about fire, really knowledgeable guy. I interviewed him, and he is a student of the weather, and he could kind of describe it, and I relate how he describes what happened in the book. But it was a huge high pressure system that pushed through, I think he says, the troposphere, which is like 65,000 feet above us. And what goes up must come down. So the intense winds were caused because that air up there cooled, and it just dropped all that stuff to the ground, and then it just didn't have any place to go, and it turned into this straight line wind that blew for quite a while. That's what happened around here, and I think that front ran all along Canada, if you remember that picture of the 6,000 mile.
Topography then too?
Yeah, topography would make a difference too, I think, but not when you're really talking about as high as the troposphere, still just hit everything. Yes?
So I'm guessing you might live in the Twin Cities?
Yeah, I do.
So we had a straight line wind event in Highland Park, which is sort of the high point in Highland Park, where the water towers are. And so it was somewhat ironic that it was one of the wealthier streets in the city, Pinehurst. Is that right? Pinehurst? And again, it was a straight line wind event that was oriented, the wind blowing east to west. And it just took out 6 or 8 blocks. Everything's flattened, pointing west. Very strange. So I don't know if you lived there. Do you remember when this was? It was after the 1999 event, but it was in an urban environment, kind of on the top of the hill, and a very localized but linear event.
It wasn't, no, it was before that. Because I had a baby stroller pushing right around the trees, so I remember that. I was running, that's what I remember.
So I don't know if you lived there then or you remember this,
I
but it's
did
again
live
a
there
similar
then, but I don't-
meteorological event.
Yeah, I don't remember that. You know, it's interesting, those aren't derechos.
It was a short distance
Yeah, they're,
compared to the...
yeah, there. And those happen a lot in the boundary waters, just like a little
We had
localized.
that 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. Here, blowdown too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they'll hit a little patch and then they dissipate.
So in writing this book, I haven't read it, it would have been better if you'd gone to Mount St. Helens. Have you been to Mount St. Helens?
Oh, I have.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
blowdown, again, it's a volcanic eruption and collapse,
Mhm.
but to go through that forest before and after, it's just unbelievable.
Oh, unbelievable. And it's unbelievable today, how
Yeah.
it's come back in
Yep.
this forest too.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
On that particular day of the blowdown, were the winds coming from the west, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most storms this time of the year come from the west.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I comment on that? We were, if you know where the Laurentian Divide lookout is, and you look across the lake, that's where our cabin is now. We didn't have a cabin at the time. We were in a pop-up trailer. And we had 5 kids under 7, with her relatives visiting. And when that came along, I distinctly remember this because I was over at the neighbors, and we had a trail between our 2 places. And as I looked up at where the Laurentian Divide lookout is, that storm came along, it was like a white rolling pin. It was spinning. I would say it was a horizontal tornado is the way it hit us. I distinctly remember you could see the trees on the other side of the lake, and then as that thing rolled in, it looked like milk being poured into a bowl. It was just a waterfall of water or cloud. And instantaneously, 120 mile an hour wind hit us, and it blasted us. And then that rolling pin went beyond us, and there was a backdraft. You could feel just as much wind coming the other way almost. And then another wave hit us. And it was almost, for where we were positioned, the trees that were down were nearly all blown from the south to the north. And in fact, I looked across to where our property was, and I realized that the path wasn't there. The canopy, which was maybe 75 feet tall at least, was all down, except for the little trees that were whippier. And I couldn't see our pop-up trailer. And at that point, I panicked, and I said to my neighbor,
Where were you?
I was in the neighbor's camp,
And all the kids and me were in the camper.
right?
And one of them was still breastfeeding. That's how little these kids were, yeah.
And my immediate thought was, I've got to get a chainsaw, because we're going to have to cut someone out. And I couldn't go down the path anymore. I had to walk to the lake, because that's the direction the trees had fallen. Walk along them, go along the shoreline, and then walk in along the trees the other way. We had 4 trees to the right of the trailer, 3 to the left, and there was sort of like an eddy wind that came through after the storm rolled through that dropped a 16-inch, really nice birch tree right behind the trailer. So it was surrounded by trees. And I looked inside, the kids were crying, but everybody was untouched. And I felt pretty damn good at that.
I haven't heard anybody describe that rolling pin
Like
thing.
a glass of milk poured into a cereal bowl. It just rolled right over that narrow, birch
Yeah.
that was narrow. Just rolled right
Yeah.
into us. And
Pressure
you could
difference.
see the white
Yeah.
just coming right towards us. And it was just seconds before it hit us.
Yeah. Yeah, and you guys on the south side of Birch, right there where the Laurentian Divide place, well, Jim, when I interviewed Jim Winnanen, he was telling me he went up there with the traffic was stopped at Trail Center, and they were actually pushing at that Laurentian Divide overlook. They were pushing, if you looked north, I guess north, I get turned around up here, but north over Birch Lake, that whole area up there was just flattened.
That's where we were.
Yeah, that's where you were. Yeah, but then further south, it was like not so bad. I mean, I think it was still bad, but it was just kind of sheared, made that run that
That's what I
sheared.
said about topography, because there's kind of cliffs on both sides of Birch, and it acts like a venturi.
Oh, yeah.
And I think probably the wind sped up
Yeah.
through there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
made a kind of
We
a
were gonna
funnel.
take the kids in for the parade in town.
Oh,
And
yeah.
those plans really changed.
That was over.
I think by the end of the day, we had cut 300 trees off the road going
Oh,
out.
my God.
Wow.
And one of our neighbors had smartly talked to a contractor who met us with a snow plow, a V plow attached to the front of their truck, just shoving them off to the side.
Wow.
And finally had a way to get out.
Well, Jim had heard something he was the director of Wilderness Canoe Base at the time, and I'm going to tell your story here in a little bit, but he'd heard that something had happened up there, so he wisely went to his neighbor and borrowed his chainsaw. And it became his ticket for getting beyond the Laurentian Divide, because he went to the deputy, hey, I got a chainsaw, come on. Anybody else? Questions or, yeah?
Just a quick story. I was in my cabin on Gunflint about, what, a quarter mile from the picture that you have on your cover shot. And hot day, everything that you've said, and I knew rain was coming. My cabin is very close to the lake, and there's a point just to the west of us. A boat came by that was heading west, and it looked like a couple people in the boat. And I said, they better hurry or they're not going to get around the point. Well, then the rain came, just pouring down, as you said. And about 4 minutes later, a woman comes running up my path from my dock and hands me a bundle and races back down to the boat. And it turns out the bundle had a baby that they had tucked their kids, there were 2 kids, they had tucked them in the front of the boat as they were heading west back to, I think they were at the Pines. And so they came in, everybody's soaking wet, trees are falling, everything is happening, but I was just so thankful that I was there to be able to help them. If they'd gone around the point, they wouldn't be with us. I haven't heard from them, so I don't know where they are now. But the kid is now, what, 25 or 26 years old, so stories to tell. Quite a day.
Yeah.
It took 3 days to get out from Gunflint. But we all had, our refrigerators were all down, so we all had our coolers. We all got together and we had potlucks for 3 days.
And the homeowners got together with chainsaws just
Oh, yeah.
to clear the road. You couldn't get out.
You couldn't get
go
out.
anywhere.
No, couldn't get out of Gunflint.
Were you on Gunflint?
Yeah, Gunflint.
Gunflint, yeah.
Yeah, just where, your pictures of the Backstroms.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That
it's the
picture is
Backstrom's
actually-
house.
That's from
Your cover shot.
University of Minnesota
Yeah.
Press. got
Yeah,
that.
that's the Backstrom's house, and they really lost everything.
That's on Gunflint.
On
Oh,
Gunflint,
that's good.
Backstrom's, and I'm about, what, a quarter mile east of
that,
there,
yeah.
about a quarter
Now,
mile
those
east.
trees, to me, looked like I thought most of the trees, you said north to south, I thought most of the trees fell west to east.
You can see it was pickup sticks, you're right. but
Yeah.
They fell in a different direction.
Yep.
But most of them, as Charlene was saying, were poplars.
And it's come back all poplar.
All
Yes.
poplar now.
Yeah, the forest changed a
Mine
little
is,
bit.
I'm surrounded by cedar, so I didn't have that much damage. which is
Oh,
nice.
nice. Bruce Kerfoot told me the story of the proprietor then of Gunflint Lodge, that he went out to the dock. They have a floating dock in front of Gunflint Lodge, and he went out to the dock right after the storm happened, because they knew they were going to have to go out and look for people and search for people, and the water had actually displaced 4 feet. So everything was much lower and down, and so all the water had been blown to the other end of Gunflint. Gunflint Lake is east-west. It had been blown to the other end of the lake. And then I tell the story about the Prices, who have a cabin on the north, the Canadian side, the north, east corner of Gunflint Lake, and he came across to check on his mother right after that, and he said the middle of Gunflint Lake was like an open ocean. It was like a big bathtub that the water just didn't know where to go, so it was huge waves. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Yes?
So we talked about the felled trees resulting from the storm, but I am amazed how many trees, these huge red-white pines, were like bent halfway over. Our aunt and uncle were in our cabin during the storm, and they looked out and saw so many of the trees were surrounded by really tall pines, and they were bent over, halfway over, but they came back. They didn't break. And so I just wonder how many trees survived the storm like that there was such flexibility in the trunks.
Yeah.
That they were able to do that, to come back. You know, and some trees, I think one fell on our gutter a year later. You know, so a lot of them were stressed and came down after, you know, much later. But I am just astounded.
Yeah, I haven't heard any statistics. Lee Frelick is a forestry professor. He's in the book, and he would probably have a good answer for that. I don't know, and I assume those are probably smaller trees.
No,
because
they're
they were big
tall.
trees, and they came back and went vertical. Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
You're on Esther with a lot of sand.
And
That
so,
you could give and maybe
Oh,
come back up.
yeah.
No,
He's describing it right.
on an esker, which is a lot of sand, the gravel pit leaves off. I dug that basement and I found one rock about like that.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Wow.
so interesting.
Yes.
Well, I was really impressed reading your book, and one of the things that struck me was for the folks in Ely, that it took a number of them quite a while to believe, was it Pat Lowe, the pilot?
Yes.
That he saw the extent and he had to get them up in the air so they would believe him.
Yeah.
Yeah, no one believed it.
No,
Because
No. It was, Pat Lowe had just become a bush pilot. He's actually from that area, so he knew a lot of the lakes from having canoed them and paddled them and stuff. But yeah, he had only been working there about 2 years, so the Forest Service people didn't know him very well. He'd come from Alaska. He'd been up in Alaska for about a decade. And he came back and he said, the forest is flattened from just outside of Ely all the way to the Chik-Wauk cabin. There's a Forest Service has a cabin up there. It looks like Little House on the Prairie, is what he said. And people just didn't believe him. And you know, another really interesting thing that happened is, I was mentioning this earlier to somebody else here, but it took a while before people recognized the significance of the damage to the area. Remember, this is July 4th, 99, before cell phones. These days, people would have been in the forest. They would have probably taken a video of those rolling winds, and then it would have blown up on social media, and and there would have been all kinds. As it was, Jan Fiola and Sue Ann Martinson, the campers, two of the women campers I talked about, they finally got down to Duluth about 2 days later, and they bought a paper, thinking it would be front page news all over, that kind of. Buried on page 6 was some sort of wind event that happened in the Boundary Waters. You know, that just wouldn't happen these days. It'd be a very different thing. Yes.
We're Canadian. We didn't know there was a talk. I found out about this by mistake. Anyways, we lived in Fort Frances across from International Falls in 1999. And on the Canadian side, the damage that was done in Quetico and in the Boundary Waters canoe area was a big concern to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And we're talking already about that shortly after the storm, about what a forest fire danger that's going to be, not currently, because it was all fresh timber that had blown over, but in subsequent years. But it was so remote. There's no roads on the Canadian side, just like there isn't in Minnesota. And so there wasn't any cleanup done just because it was
Too hard.
inaccessible.
Yeah.
But it has always been a concern of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources because we knew if it was going to start on fire, it was really going to go. And I'm a forester, so when I read the book, even though I wasn't on this side of the border, it really meant a lot to me because I could visualize how that fire was advancing just based on my experience. And just driving up here, and we were up here a couple weekends ago as well, and you see the residual of the burnt wood. It's like, I don't know how anybody didn't think that wasn't going to jump the Gunflint Trail. Because that fire, the intensity of that fire.
Yeah, you're talking about the Ham Lake fire of 2007.
Yeah. Sorry, you've got the book up there, so I was. Sorry. I just started reading that. Now, as far as the white pine go, the other thing is too, we have such shallow soils in this part of North America, and so the roots are very extensive of a white pine and red pine, and you have to look at, I always say if you were a giant, you could pull a tree out of the soil, that what you see on top is at minimum what you see below in the root system. When that wind for those trees that maybe came back up, they hadn't been blown over, they were still at their area, and they just sort of kind of straighten themselves out, not because somebody pushed them back up, but they were sort of precarious, and then they were able, had they been blown maybe an inch or more down, they may not have recovered.
Yes. Well, and so many did.
Yeah, exactly. But when they blew over, you saw the roots with them. I did forestry research in the north of Fort Francis in the White Pine there, and you're on bare bedrock with no soil, and you wonder how these 300-year-old white pines can survive, because the roots go down in the cracks of the rocks, and you don't even know how they're feeding themselves with nutrients, because there isn't any shallow soil for them to suck nutrients out of. So it's quite amazing that the blowdown wasn't actually worse.
Yeah, well, that was the summer before the 4th of July blowdown in '99 was a really wet summer, so the ground was really saturated. That was an exacerbating factor in the trees. Yes?
Was there, or is there any other documented event similar to this anywhere else in the country?
Well, yeah, derechos happen all over the upper Midwest. Not usually this high. I think there was a significant derecho up in Canada that blew down a whole bunch of trees, but not to the extent that this was a 6,000-mile storm. It was a much bigger storm.
And isn't it odd that it went down the East Coast and then back?
Very odd, yeah. I mean, who knows what the the meteorological aspects of that were, but yeah, that was kind of strange the way that whole thing, and then it turned inland. Yes?
Did anybody that you interviewed describe the sound? What did they hear?
Yeah, well, Pete Weckman, he was right in the heart of it, and he saw it coming on. He didn't talk about rolling so much, but it was kind of like that. He talked about animals just being picked up like cranes and that, and just thrown into the wind, like trying to fly out of it, and just ducks and that kind of thing. But he described the way people describe a tornado. It was the sound of an approaching locomotive, was how he said it sounded. I don't know if you guys.
Oh, we heard were cracking trees.
Oh, cracking trees, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Why do they call it derechos, and where does that come from, those winds?
The tornadoes is Spanish for turning wind, and derecho is Spanish for straight. So the guy in 1850s who identified that this straight line wind had happened for 250 miles, it actually happened in Iowa. He coined the term, let's call it derecho because that's straight in Spanish. Yes?
When you're in the middle of a storm, you kind of hear it coming. And when you're in the middle of it, all you hear is wind. And I mentioned that I was at my neighbor's and he had this kind of tent or canopy over a deck. And we were drinking beer, so he grabbed his canvas on his tent he of course grabbed it and poured his beer down my back. But after it was through and I was getting ready to go out to the lake and check on things, he said, "You're pretty lucky." And I said, "Why?" I was on the edge of the deck, and probably 3 feet behind me was a 2-inch diameter jack pine, and that had just sheared off. I never heard it shear off. 2 feet. Yeah. It sheared right off in the wind. You couldn't even hear the sound of that because the roar of the wind was so loud.
How long did it last? I mean,
20 minutes.
Yeah, I would say no more than a minute, seemed, or 2 minutes. It was over. Rolled right through.
Yeah, you know, I asked a lot of
There
people.
was rain. There was a lot of rain that followed it. But the
Yeah,
storm-
there was so much, you know, troubling weather that preceded it right up to the point, and then the impact happened, and then they just kept raining, and so people never could give me a real clear idea. That's why I say it was kind of from noon to 2. Yeah, depending upon where you were in the boundary, because it was traveling, you know. Yes.
There was, now I wasn't here, but my husband was at our cabin, and he almost described it as like an eye of a hurricane. There was a spot during the storm where it got quiet, and he was able to go out and retrieve a canoe that was just about going to blow away, that he had seen moving, and he was able to get out there and bring that canoe. So it was, and then it hit with a second wave where we were. We were way at the end of, I think the wind lifted after it got to the end of our road, and then over by Flower Lake. It did some damage there. And then that was the end of the real extreme damage.
Yeah, going from Bemidji or Fargo all the way in, it seemed to like hopscotch, the straight line winds, until it got outside of Ely, got east of Ely. Then it just went into that swath that was like 40 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide. And then I think it picked up again, and then it went into Canada, did a lot of damage in Canada, and just kept, the north end of Gunflint Lake, which is in Canada, had a lot of damage too. Yes?
I was just wondering about your writing process. How much research do you do before you start writing?
I kind of do it all, I interview a lot of people. My practice is to identify them, interview them, transcribe their remarks, figure out whether or not I want to use them in the story some way. So it's kind of ongoing, all the research. And eventually I get to a point where I've talked to so many people and have so many stories, I have to figure out who am I going to include, who am I going to, like John Pierce had a really compelling story. I wrote up his whole thing, that Ranger, and I was going to include it, but it just didn't fit right for what I was trying to do, so I used it in that magazine article. It worked good for that, because he had a great story to tell, what to do when you go into the woods at this time of year.
So do you get page limitations from your publisher, editor?
Word limitations. I personally like the 80,000 word length because it makes for a slimmer book, and in these days with limited attention spans, you don't want to do pearl bugs. Yes.
In your research, did you discover how extensive the blowdown was in 49 that was up here?
In 1949? No, I don't. I think somebody may have mentioned that, but I didn't do any research in that. Was it significant in the?
That's what I don't know. My father said that Chik-Wauk had some damage and lost trees, and that winter it was easy to go get firewood and just put it in the woods.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if that was localized, if it was, there was in 1991, I want to say, in this. The only other one I found that hit the boundary waters more like a derecho, a longer thing, was in southern boundary waters. Most of the, in the upper Midwest, most of them happen in Iowa, southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, lower latitudes than this. This was really unusual that it was at this extreme at this latitude. Well, it's at 3:05. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Feel free to mingle, hang out. We have some books still for sale. And I think Cary would stick around and sign those if you want to get a book. Join us for future events. Thanks so much for coming. And thank this group, as always, for your support of Chik-Wauk.